The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from something breaking. Ethan Miller sat alone at the far end of the room, feet dangling from a chair too big for him. 11 years old, yet he looked smaller. Not just in size, but in presence, like someone who had learned how to take up less space in the world. Judge Caroline Hayes scanned the file in front of her, lips tight. Another failed placement. The Thompsons had returned him after just 2 weeks. Too quiet, they'd said. He doesn't bond. It's like he's not even trying. Ethan didn't flinch. He just stared ahead, hollow-eyed, as if this wasn't the first time his future had been decided without him. Because it wasn't. The gavel was never struck. Instead, Judge Hayes closed the file and looked up. "Everyone out," she said. Gasps echoed. Lawyers hesitated. But her voice cut sharper this time. "Clear the courtroom." As the doors shut behind them, Ethan remained still. Then for the first time in years, he looked someone in the eyes. Judge Hayes met his gaze and felt something inside her fracture. This wasn't just another case. This was him. Before we dive deeper into Ethan's unbelievable journey, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we tell real stories you won't find anywhere else. Stories that stay with you. Join our community now, because the next one might change the way you see the world. Ethan Miller had lived in 6 different homes by the time he turned 10. He wasn't born into chaos, at least not in the traditional sense. His mother had been young, barely out of high school, and his father had never been part of the story. At 4 years old, Ethan was found alone in a locked apartment, clutching a box of cereal, watching cartoons on mute. It wasn't abuse, it was absence. From there, the system became his world. Group homes, temporary fosters, trial placements. Every few months, new bedsheets, new rules, new people trying to smile like it wasn't just their job. He never caused trouble, never screamed, never acted out. And that was the problem. Ethan didn't cry when a family sent him back. He didn't beg to stay. He just folded his clothes, packed his bag, and waited at the door. The adults called it emotional detachment, but in truth, it was survival. If he didn't expect love, he wouldn't miss it when it disappeared. Inside, though, Ethan was full of questions he never asked. Why not me? What did I do wrong? Will anyone ever stay? His teachers described him as bright, maybe gifted, quiet, but curious. He read books far above his grade level and loved anything about outer space. There was something about distant planets that made sense to him, cold, quiet, but still existing, still turning. Ethan didn't make friends easily, not because he didn't want to, but because saying goodbye had become a routine. He had learned that people left. Families, teachers, therapists, they all promised permanence until they didn't. But under the silence, a small flicker remained. Every time he packed a bag, he folded one particular drawing and placed it on top. A house with a red door, a dog in the yard, 2 people holding a child's hand. No faces, just outlines. It wasn't a memory, it was a hope. Even after the rejections, after hearing words like damaged or unbonded, Ethan still carried that picture, still believed in something better, even if he didn't dare say it out loud, because maybe, just maybe, if he didn't give up completely, someone else wouldn't either. When Ethan was 7, something different happened. A couple from upstate, Brian and Linda Thompson, showed up at the group home. They weren't like the others, no rushed interviews, no awkward smiles pretending to be warm. Linda brought books, Brian brought puzzles, and neither of them asked Ethan to hug them. They just sat with him. Week after week they came back. Sometimes they read stories. Sometimes they just sat silently in the common room while Ethan worked on his drawings. No pressure, no fake enthusiasm. For the first time, he felt like maybe someone saw him without trying to fix him. Then, one afternoon, Linda knelt beside him. "We'd like you to come live with us, Ethan," she said softly. His fingers tightened around his pencil. He looked up, searching for the lie in her eyes. But there was only patience. The day he moved in, he carried only one bag and that same old drawing, the red door, the faceless family. Brian taped it to the fridge. Ethan got his own room. They painted the walls a pale blue and let him choose the bedding. He picked stars and moons. Linda packed his lunches. Brian helped with homework. They enrolled him in a small school nearby where the teacher actually knew his name. For the first time, he started to believe this might be it. He let himself smile more, talk more. He left his backpack on the floor without worrying someone would say it was in the way. He even asked Linda once quietly if they'd ever had a dog. She said no, but maybe someday. He began to imagine birthdays, a Christmas tree, a dog, a family. Then came the night when everything cracked. He woke up from a nightmare and called for Linda. She came running, half asleep, and held him. But when he couldn't stop crying, when he finally whispered what he remembered, that locked apartment, the hunger, the waiting, she froze. The next day, he overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. "I thought he was fine. But he's not. He's too broken, Brian." That evening, they told him he was going back just for a little while. He didn't ask why. He didn't cry. He just packed again. The ride back to the group home was quiet. No goodbye hugs. Just the echo of a slammed car door and the sound of wheels rolling down a hallway he thought he'd never walk again. The drawing. He didn't put it on top this time. He buried it at the bottom of the bag. After the Thompsons, something in Ethan shifted. The staff at the group home noticed it almost immediately. He stopped asking questions, stopped meeting new families. When potential adoptive parents came in, he stayed in his room, headphones on, pretending to sleep. No more drawings, no more books, no more hope. He'd learned the rule: if you don't expect anything, you can't lose it. Over the next 2 years, Ethan was placed with 4 more families. Some lasted weeks, others only days. Every time, the feedback was eerily similar. He's polite, but distant. Hard to connect with. Doesn't feel like part of the family. They called him emotionally unresponsive, resistant, withdrawn. But Ethan wasn't trying to be difficult. He was just trying to survive without breaking again. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice had started to whisper, "Maybe you're not meant to be wanted." At 9, he stopped asking when someone would come for him. He stopped marking the calendar with hopeful circles. He became invisible in plain sight. Just another file in a crowded system. Another child the world had given up on. The only person who continued to show up was Judge Caroline Hayes. She'd presided over his case since the beginning, seen every failed placement, every progress report, every returned suitcase. At first, she treated his situation like all the others, professionally, with structure and procedure. But slowly, reluctantly, she began to notice something she didn't want to admit. Every time Ethan sat before her, he seemed smaller. Not physically, but spiritually, like a flame growing dimmer. And every time she signed another release order, it haunted her a little longer. One day, after Ethan's 6th failed placement, she asked to speak with him privately. It wasn't protocol, but she needed to look him in the eyes. "Do you want to be adopted, Ethan?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged, not out of disrespect, but because he genuinely didn't know anymore. "I don't think it works for me," he said quietly. "I think maybe I wasn't made right." Those words stayed with her. Not just that day, but every day after. Still, the system moved on. More paperwork, more evaluations, more rejections. By the time Ethan turned 11, no new families were calling, no visits, no interviews. His file had been quietly labeled as low placement priority. And for the first time since entering foster care, Ethan stopped hoping entirely. He didn't fold the drawing anymore. He crumpled it, tossed it into a drawer, and left it there, forgotten. Because dreams, no matter how quietly held, eventually die when no one else believes in them. By the time Ethan entered his 12th year, he had mastered the art of disappearing without ever leaving. He walked the hallways of the group home like a shadow, slipping through rooms with barely a sound. He stopped talking in full sentences, answered questions with nods or shrugs, smiled only when someone was watching, and only for their comfort. His therapist, Dr. Emily Sanders, tried to reach him, Weekly sessions turned into silent hours where Ethan stared at the floor, counting the seconds until it was over. When she asked him to describe his feelings, he replied flatly, "They're too quiet to hear." The truth was, he was tired. Not physically, but soul-deep tired. Tired of trying, tired of pretending, tired of being reminded again and again that he was unwanted. One rainy afternoon, Ethan sat by the window, knees tucked under his chin, watching the drops race each other down the glass. A volunteer walked by and asked if he wanted to draw. He shook his head. The staff thought he'd outgrown art. But the truth was crueler. He just couldn't bring himself to draw that house again, not when he no longer believed it could exist. The final breaking point came when he overheard two caseworkers discussing his file. "He's a permanent placement now," one of them whispered. "No one's going to take an 11-year-old with attachment issues. It's sad, but at this point, he's unadoptable." Unadoptable. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't run. He didn't scream. That night he tried to run away. He made it 6 blocks before the cold stopped him, not because he was afraid, but because there was nowhere to go, nowhere that felt different than where he already was. A police officer brought him back. The group home director scolded him gently. "You scared us," she said. But Ethan didn't reply. He was no longer angry. Anger had burned out months ago. Now there was only emptiness. The next day, he refused to go to school. Curled up under the covers, he stared at the wall for hours. No books, no noise, no food. He had disappeared. Completely. When Judge Caroline Hayes received the report, something inside her unraveled. She had seen hundreds of children pass through her courtroom. Some angry, some broken, some beautifully resilient. But Ethan had always haunted her. There was a silence in him that felt familiar. Against every rule, she drove to the group home unannounced. She told the director she wanted to speak with him, privately. When she entered the small recreation room, she found him sitting alone on the floor, back against the wall, holding something in his lap. It was the drawing, wrinkled, torn in one corner, but still intact. She sat beside him slowly. "You kept it," she whispered. Ethan didn't look at her. "I tried to throw it away," he murmured, "but I couldn't." There was a long pause. Then, without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wilted flower, just a weed, really, that he'd picked on the way back from school the day before. He held it out to her, awkward and unsure. Caroline took it without hesitation. That moment shattered something she had spent years building, her detachment, her distance, her role. She remembered being 9, sleeping on a mattress in a church basement, waiting for someone who never came. She had buried that part of herself so deeply she thought it was gone. But Ethan had found it. In silence, in stillness, in shared invisibility. That night, she cried in her car for the first time in over a decade. She couldn't pretend anymore. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't just another child in a broken system. This was Ethan, and for the first time, she allowed herself to ask a question she never had before. What if I'm the one who's supposed to stay? If Ethan's story is touching something deep in you, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, just one voice can echo what others feel in silence, and your words might be the reminder someone else needs to keep believing. Judge Caroline Hayes had never questioned her boundaries. She believed in the system, even with all its flaws. She believed that professionalism required distance, that emotion clouded judgment, that involvement beyond the bench was dangerous. But after sitting beside Ethan in that quiet room, holding a crushed flower from a boy who had given up on being wanted, all of that began to crumble. She couldn't sleep that night. Her mind kept replaying Ethan's voice. Soft, distant. I wasn't made right. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was recognition. Echoes of a younger version of herself, abandoned, invisible, terrified to want anything because wanting only led to disappointment. She hadn't just seen Ethan. She had remembered him. In herself. The next morning, she drove to her office early, hours before the first hearing. She pulled out Ethan's case file and placed it on her desk. For the first time, she didn't look at it as a judge, but as someone who had once needed the very thing he was begging for in silence. Love. She began visiting the group home on weekends. No announcements, no formalities, just walks in the garden, board games, conversations that didn't start with, "How are you feeling?" but with, "Want to beat me at checkers?" At first, Ethan didn't respond. He watched her warily, expecting it to end like everything else did. But she kept showing up. One Sunday, he asked her if she'd ever been a foster kid. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just once," she said. "A long time ago." "Did it work out?" he asked. She paused. "Eventually." That one word, eventually, planted something. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. Ethan started waiting for her, asking when she'd come back, drawing again, spaceships this time, orbiting empty planets. He even gave her one, saying, "This one doesn't crash." She taped it inside her briefcase. Still, Caroline struggled. The system didn't allow for what she was beginning to feel. Judges didn't become parents to their cases. She wasn't supposed to blur that line, but she couldn't ignore the pull. Every time she walked away from Ethan, something in her resisted. Every time she walked toward him, something in her healed. She spoke with Dr. Sanders, then with Margaret Green, the group home director. She asked questions, quiet ones at first, then bolder ones. What would it take? Could this even happen? Is it allowed? The answers were complicated, but not impossible. For the first time in years, Caroline found herself facing a different kind of decision, one not dictated by law, but by love. And in the quiet of her home that night, surrounded by years of carefully built solitude, she whispered to herself what she had never dared to say aloud. "I want him." The decision didn't happen overnight. Judge Hayes moved carefully, quietly. She wasn't ready to file papers, not yet. But she needed to keep showing up, for him and for herself. Each visit to the group home became more than routine. It became a rhythm. Saturdays meant chess in the common room. Sundays meant walks past the old oak trees behind the building. She started bringing books Ethan hadn't read before, science fiction mostly. Stories about lonely kids finding their way across galaxies. Ethan didn't smile right away. He didn't call her by name, didn't ask her questions. But slowly, something shifted. One day she found a note in one of the books she'd lent him. A piece of paper, carefully folded, with a drawing on one side, a rocket flying over a house with a red door. No faces, just the shapes again. But this time there were two figures standing in the doorway. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't have to. At the group home, staff began to notice the change. Ethan was more present. He volunteered to set the table. He started helping the younger kids with homework. He even laughed once, really laughed, during a game of cards with Caroline. Margaret Green watched carefully. She'd seen too many kids fall back after short moments of light, but this felt different, sustainable, real. Caroline knew she was getting close to a line. Every moment with Ethan blurred the boundaries she had built her entire life around, but she wasn't afraid anymore. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch steps of the home, she asked gently, "If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?" He thought for a long time. "Somewhere quiet," he said, "with someone who stays." The next day she began preparing. She didn't tell Ethan. Not yet. She wanted to be sure, legally, emotionally, entirely. She had to go through a background check, a home study, psychological evaluations. It wasn't as simple as signing a paper. Judges couldn't adopt cases under their jurisdiction without intense scrutiny. She stepped away from his case officially, transferring it to another judge. A formal boundary for an informal truth. Behind the scenes, the process had begun, but Ethan didn't know. And Caroline carried that secret like something sacred. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew how fragile hope could be when it had already been shattered so many times. She needed to be certain before she asked him to believe again. Still, he noticed something. The way she lingered a little longer when she said goodbye. the way her hands trembled slightly when he handed her a new drawing, and most of all the way she looked at him, not like a child to be fixed or a file to be closed, but like a boy who was already home. The process wasn't smooth. As soon as Caroline submitted the initial paperwork for adoption, questions flooded in from every direction. Judicial ethics boards, child services, her own colleagues, everyone had an opinion. Some were supportive, others weren't. "Are you crossing a line, Judge Hayes? Is this about him or about something unresolved in you? This could damage your career." She listened, carefully, respectfully, but she didn't step back. Ethan wasn't a case file anymore. He was a boy who had waited long enough for someone to choose him without conditions, and if that meant facing judgment herself, she could live with it. But the hardest part wasn't the scrutiny. It was keeping the truth from Ethan. He noticed the distance again, shorter visits, her quiet tension, the way she suddenly seemed distracted. He feared he was losing her, just like the others. One evening, after dinner at the group home, he pulled her aside. "Are you going to stop coming?" he asked, not angrily, just tired. She froze. "No," she said softly, "but I have to do a few things before I can keep coming the way I want to." He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, eyes flat, and turned away. That night, she wept. Because for all her intentions, he was still waiting in the dark, not knowing that behind the scenes doors were opening, papers were moving, reviews were being cleared. And then, just as things began to align, there was a setback. One of the board members flagged her case for conflict of interest. The adoption was paused pending further investigation. Weeks went by with no update. Visits had to stop entirely for a period. No contact allowed. Ethan received the news without reaction. No questions, no protest. He simply folded the rocket drawing and placed it back inside his drawer. The silence returned, heavily. But Caroline wasn't done. She submitted statements, sat through hearings, answered difficult questions about her motivations, her history, her relationship to Ethan. She laid herself bare to strangers for the right to be his mother. And finally, after what felt like years pressed into weeks, the approval came. Caroline could adopt Ethan. It wasn't official yet, but the final court date had been set. The paperwork had cleared. The home inspection was passed. Everything was ready. All that was left was to tell him. She asked Margaret for permission to visit. This time, no games, no books, just her. When Ethan saw her, he stood still at the doorway, unsure. Caroline knelt down slowly and looked him in the eye. "I didn't stop coming because I gave up," she said. "I stopped because I was getting ready to bring you home." His eyes didn't widen. He didn't gasp. He simply stared. "Home?" he whispered. She nodded. "If you'll still have me." He didn't answer with words. He just walked forward and wrapped his arms around her, tight, like he didn't trust himself to let go. And this time she didn't either. The courtroom looked nothing like it did the last time Ethan had been there. Gone were the cold walls and distant voices, the quiet judgment wrapped in legal language. This time, there were fewer people, softer lighting, and, for the first time in his life, a seat reserved just for him, not as a ward of the state, but as someone about to belong. Judge Rebecca Lynn, a longtime colleague of Caroline's, had agreed to preside over the hearing. She smiled as Ethan entered, wearing a button-down shirt slightly too big for him and shoes he hadn't wanted to scuff on the way in. Caroline walked beside him, not as a judge, but as something still new, something sacred, a mother. Everyone in the room seemed to understand the weight of what was happening. The caseworkers sat quietly, no laptops open. Margaret Green had come, holding back tears before the session even began. Even Dr. Sanders was there, giving Ethan a small nod from across the aisle. No notes, no clipboard, just pride. "Ethan Miller," Judge Lynn said gently, "do you know why you're here today?" He looked up, unsure if he should speak. Then Caroline leaned in, whispering something only he could hear. With a small breath he replied, "Because I finally get to stay." The room fell into stillness. Judge Lynn smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, you finally get to stay." The formalities began. Motions, waivers, affirmations. Caroline answered every question clearly, steadily, but with a tremble in her voice that only Ethan seemed to notice. She had waited her whole life to be many things, but this mattered more than all of them. "And do you understand," Judge Lynn asked Ethan directly, "that Caroline Hayes is petitioning to become your legal parent? Your forever guardian?" He nodded. "Do you wish for that, Ethan?" He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket. A folded paper, creased and worn. The drawing, the house, the two figures in the doorway. He held it up. "This was my dream," he said. "But I stopped believing it could happen." Then he looked at Caroline. "Until she did." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Judge Lynn, her voice breaking just slightly, said the words that would change everything. "By the authority of this court, I grant the adoption. Ethan Miller, you are no longer in foster care. Caroline Hayes, you are now his legal mother." Gasps. Tears. Applause held back only by respect. Caroline reached for him as if afraid he'd vanish, and he clung to her as if afraid she wouldn't be real. But she was. When they left the courtroom, photographers weren't waiting. There were no balloons, no cake, no dramatic music, just a hallway, a quiet ride, and a key in her hand. "Are you ready to see your room?" she asked. He nodded. When they walked into the house, his house, it wasn't grand or flashy, but the walls were painted the same pale blue he remembered from the Thompsons' home. His bed had stars and moons. On the dresser sat every book she'd ever given him. And above the bed, framed and centered, was the drawing, the house, the rocket, the two figures. Only now she had added something new, their names, Caroline and Ethan. That night they didn't talk much. She made dinner, he helped set the table. There were awkward silences, hesitant smiles. But then, after the dishes were done and the lights were low, Ethan walked into the living room and sat beside her. "Can I ask something?" he said. "Anything. Do I call you Caroline or Mom?" She looked at him for a long time. "You can call me whatever you want," she said softly. "But I'd really love it if someday you wanted to call me Mom." He was quiet, then almost too quietly to hear, "Okay, Mom." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Later, after he was asleep, she stood in the doorway of his room and watched him breathe. One hand clutched the drawing. The other held the edge of the blanket she had tucked in. He was home. And for the first time in his life, so was she. Some stories don't need grand finales. Sometimes the most powerful moments are quiet, whispered in hallways, drawn in crayon, or said with trembling voices across courtroom benches. Ethan's story isn't just about a boy who was adopted. It's about what happens when someone dares to see a child not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth staying for. The lesson isn't about the flaws in the system, though they're many. It's not even about the number of homes or the failed placements. It's about endurance, about a child who kept showing up even when every goodbye made him smaller, and about a woman who spent her life creating justice for others, only to discover that sometimes the most radical form of justice is love. Judge Caroline Hayes didn't break the law. She honored a deeper truth. That paperwork can declare custody, but presence builds family. That legal language can outline boundaries, but real connection happens in board games, in silence, in the act of simply returning again and again. Ethan taught everyone around him something they didn't expect to learn, that hope doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's quiet, folded into old drawings, hidden in backpacks, waiting for someone to notice. And when someone finally does, everything changes. Years passed. Ethan didn't become a symbol or a headline. He became a teenager, then a young man, quiet still but no longer hollow. He graduated high school with honors, then went on to study social work, drawn not by theory but by memory. He never forgot what it felt like to wait for someone who never came, so he became someone who does come. Ethan now works with kids in the very system that once labeled him unadoptable. He visits shelters, reads to children, listens without judgment. And every time he meets a child who believes they are too much or not enough, he pulls out a copy of his old drawing. The house, the rocket, the door that finally opened. He doesn't share his story to inspire pity. He shares it to remind them that survival is not the same as healing, and that healing is possible. Caroline eventually retired from the bench, quietly. No speeches, no big farewells. Just a final gavel tap and a deep breath as she stepped into a chapter where her title no longer defined her. Now, she is simply Mom. And together, they have created something that once only existed in dreams. A life built not on blood, but on choice. A home chosen. A family earned. How many Ethans are out there right now, waiting in silence, drawing pictures they no longer believe in? And how many Carolines are walking through life, never realizing they could be the answer to someone's quietest hope? This story isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about what happens when someone refuses to walk away. When love breaks through red tape, fear and hesitation and says, "I see you, I'm not going anywhere." If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask the hard questions. Maybe even look around your own life and ask, is there someone I could show up for? Leave a comment below. Tell us what part of Ethan's journey hit you the hardest. Or tell us about someone who stayed for you when you needed it most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel for more real, powerful stories like this one. Because every time you engage, this message reaches further. Every time you share, another door opens. And maybe, just maybe, the next child waiting in silence won't have to wait so long.